Hi, this is Mary Beth Allenbaugh, and this is my Module 6 activity for critically thinking about FAPE, NDE, and LRE. So the first question is, what is disproportionality and why it's a concern? So disproportionality is the overrepresentation or underrepresentation of a particular population or demographic group in special or gifted education programs. And that's relative to the presence of that group, the particular population or demographic group, in the overall student population. This is from Truth in Labeling Disproportionality in Special Education that was published by the National Education Association. And CLD, which I'll be referring to later, is a culturally and linguistically diverse student or demographic. So IDEA, this is why disproportionality is a concern. The IDEA requires that all states define how they measure disproportionality, but all states use various methods and no single way. So in reality, each state is allowed to decide what level of disproportionality is significant, and this varies from state to state. So this concern comes from our own law, or the letter of the law, where each state is varying on how they view disproportionality, which makes each state have a different number for disproportionality or overrepresentation or underrepresentation of certain groups. So who's affected by it? Well, who's affected by it is all of our CLD students, our culturally and linguistically diverse students, but also our white students, just because the disproportionality is related to them as well, because they are being referred to, or they're being compared to with the other races. So a lot of this comes from stereotypes and how the Asian and Pacific Islanders are overrepresented in gifted and talented programs, but also Asian students are less likely to be identified as having a disability. And I believe that it comes from that stereotype. Native Americans are more likely to receive special education services, while Hispanics are under-identified within the certain disability categories compared to the white students. And then the most information that is on this disproportionality, I believe, is comparing Black male students to their white peers. And Black male students are labeled emotionally disturbed at twice the rate of their white peers. And Black students are also 2 times as likely to receive special education services for emotional disturbances as other culturally linguistically diverse groups. And what contributing factors this entails? I believe it entails all of the information that I gave you earlier about how the IDEA requires all states to define how they measure. So that's also not helpful. But also, in the article labeled Caught in the Continuum, a critical analysis of the principle of least restrictive environment, the least restrictive principle in the letter of the law supports the primacy of professional decision-making, where the professional is in charge of what is appropriate or possible for the student with a disability, meaning that the professional is in charge of ensuring that the student gets referred to special education services, where sometimes unfortunately, that professional is stereotypical or biased towards certain groups and CLD students. So as these questions involve FAPE, or free and appropriate education, non-destructive education, and least restrictive environment, minoritized groups in U.S. society, and especially with the IDEA and FAPE, free and appropriate education is law. The federal law entitles all children with disabilities to receive a free and appropriate education. But it also mandates non-discriminatory assessment and identification. So, and studies show that CLD students with disabilities are often segregated in more segregated or restrictive environments than their white peers. So although the law is entitling all children with disabilities to a FAPE, it's not necessarily giving them the LRE, or least restrictive environment. 55% of white students with disabilities spend 80% of their school day in general education classes, while only a third of Black students with disabilities spend 80% of their school day in a general education classroom. So these students from minority populations are being identified as having emotional disabilities, but they're not being given an adequate opportunity to learn because they're placed in more segregated settings than their white counterparts. So all of these have to deal with the contributing factors of why disproportionality is such a big topic in special education as it refers to the children receiving FAPE, LRE, and NDE. And that is it. Thank you.